Afternoon, Matt. How are you doing today?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for asking and welcome to Reel In Films. We're going to talk about your soundtrack of the upcoming movie Your Lucky Day. An amazing film, I gotta say.
Thank
So
you.
going straightforward to the first question, what inspired you to make the soundtrack for this film?
Well, I've been working with and friends with the director Dan Brown for about 20 years now. We met in Seattle, working on kind of more commercial projects. I think our first project ever, we worked on a trailer together, and he was on the visual effects team, and I was doing audio. And so I've just always really believed in Dan. His films are always amazing, and he would always be doing these short films on the side for fun, kind of passion projects. And I basically said, anytime you're doing anything, I'd love to be involved because he has such a unique vision and unique way of telling stories. And so we actually worked on. He had created a short version of Your Lucky Day back in 2010 and I scored that. So it was a very short film. It was only a few minutes of music, but it was a really cool idea. And so fast forward to 2020, and I actually saw in a trade magazine that he was filming the feature, and I was like, whoa! So I gave him a call immediately, and this was like I think it was on like New Year's Eve or Christmas Eve or something that I called him, which is really interesting because it's Christmas Eve where this movie takes place. But I called him up and I said, "Hey, man, you're making a feature length of Your Lucky Day," and he's like, "Yeah, I've been meaning to call you." So we met a few weeks later, and he told me about what he was doing with it and the concept, and I was on board immediately. I was just excited to get to work with him again on this.
So moving forward with that. So being the fact that you worked on the short, how different was the inspiration with the featured film? Because now we're talking about short film usually it's like what 5-10 minutes, I would say, and then you
Yeah.
have now an almost 2 hour long film. Uh how was that transition with something that you already worked with before?
Yeah, good question. They're definitely just two different beasts. So there was no attempt to musically try to connect the short to the feature in any way. Like I said, there were some songs I think in the short. I had written a couple of short cues that were just very textural, setting the mood, but there was no opportunity for any sort of like thematic development or anything like that because it's just not enough time. It's just kind of like you said, just a few minutes. So the feature, we also the big difference between the feature and the short was that the feature takes place on Christmas Eve, which the short wasn't the case.
Okay.
And so and that was something that was surprising. But Dan and I had a long 3 hour I think conversation before I ever even saw a cut of the film about his ideas, his thoughts, what he was trying to convey. And we knew we were going to, be doing a very dark, moody score, very textural, with some thematic elements for sure. But I said, what's one thing that you want to make sure is reflected in the score that maybe we haven't talked about? And he said, well, I'd love there to be a holiday element in there. And I was like, wow, how are we going to make that work? Because you think of the holiday music, it's so cheery and everything,
Yeah.
and most of it anyway. And then here we've got this kind of dark tale. But what that did do was afford us to have some really fun kind of, I don't, moments where I can quote, familiar holiday, motifs just in the background of the score, kind of, on occasion to just kind of a little hints like, oh yeah, this is all happening during Christmas. And, with the story itself being about this kind of, the American dream and, kind of a broken American dream, I guess. Um, what's more like the American dream than Christmas and winning the lottery, so
Yeah.
it definitely was some interesting things to play with musically and gave us a lot of room to kind of have a little bit of fun in the midst of a fairly dark tale.
I want to ask because being the first time that I actually talk about more about the composing part of a film, how is that process? You mentioned that you had a conversation with Dan, but how is it the process? Do you sit down with him like in a studio or at your home and and you guys see the film together while putting those the the cues and everything of the music?
Yes, that's exactly right. So the first, I'll usually have a conversation, and sometimes that is maybe we're not even watching the movie. We just, if it's a director I've not worked with before, we're getting to know each other a little bit as well and talk about the project. But soon after that, there's always what's called a spotting session. And so historically, yeah, you would sit in together in whether it's at the edit bay, with the editor and the director, or in my studio where I've been sent a cut of the film and we watch it together, and we go through and spot the movie, which is basically means where do we want music to come in and out? What function does that music need to provide, and perform? And then just kind of get a general sense of the feeling and the pacing. Because for me, I get a lot of inspiration from not just the story, but which I usually by then will know if I've read the script, but the pacing, the color, the everything can really change based on just the direction of the film and the editing and pacing of the film. And then you finally see the actors and what do they, how do they, how's their acting and their delivery of lines, and and any sound effects. If usually early on there's none of that really in place yet, but if is a lot of sound design, I like to hear that too. Like what do I need to work around and work with? So that's the first step in the process, is just that spotting session. Because of COVID, that changed a lot. We started on this film almost 2 years ago. At least that's when I came on, over a year and a half ago, certainly. And so we were still kind of in the midst of a little bit of, people had gotten used to not getting together. And so we did our first spotting session actually over Zoom. So, and that was, that's something more common now, but and a lot of people, they'll do that just because it's so convenient and so much quicker than getting together. But personally, I like getting together in person, and in a room together, because I really feel like I can feel the energy of, especially if we're reviewing music that I'm writing. I can get a better sense of their initial reaction to things when I'm in the room with them. Over Zoom, it's a little harder to kind of read the reactions. So.
No, yeah, I imagine, because yeah, I've heard so many conversations that most of the things that you used to do, like in an office or in the studio, or in the editing room, it now changed to being on a Zoom call and a shared screen.
Yeah.
So going off of that, so you did mention that you prefer more being with the director or the editor next to you. Uh, how is it that you guys like work together in the I would say like in the editing sense of adding the music when everything is already added? Is there another conversation before they go ahead and present that final cut?
Yes, there's a lot of back and forth usually. It's very rare that my first piece of music that I write for a scene ends up being, untouched until the end. And the main reason for that being the edit changes. You know what I mean? So like when I start working, I don't have a locked edit usually. And in fact, the edit is oftentimes changing right up till the last second. So that's one aspect of my job is, even if they like the music, they might cut a scene almost entirely out or out altogether, or they may make it longer, and so I have to go back and adjust the music to fit the scene. And and then there's also the conversation creatively. We have our conversations, we talk. Sometimes they have examples of things that they like, sometimes not. In this case, I came on really early, so there wasn't a whole lot of temp music, which is what they call, like a temporary score. Um, and so that was kind of nice actually, because we had this blank canvas to just be creative and do our thing. But there's usually some back and forth. I'll take my first pass. That's my initial gut reaction of this is how I feel like this should be scored, and then the director may love it, or they may say, this is working, but I really felt like I wanted more energy in the end, or I think we're getting there, but there's something about this moment here that feels like it's not capturing the emotion that I had in mind. And those are great conversations to have, because I don't know the story as intimately as that director does. And especially in this case, he wrote the script and directed it. He has a vision, and my job is to support his vision. I I am not there to create a piece of music that then they're providing me visuals for. You know, it's the other way around. I'm creating music to support their vision for their film. So that's my first, my first goal is to make sure, am I telling the story that you want to tell? Am I hitting the emotional beats you want to hit? And are we giving the audience the subtext of the scene that you wanted to convey? Maybe there's some sort of, the scene, everything that's going on, looks normal, like another day, and a day in the life, but the music is telling you something else, like, oh, something's about to happen, or there's something wrong here. The music can create a lot of subtext that you can't get visually. So.
Okay, that's really great. So I did beforehand, doing a little bit of research and everything, I did notice that you worked on two films that I got to see as well, and did notice like I would say a genre that you might have touched a little bit much more frequent. Um, because I did see the film Our Father and Ma, that you worked on them
Mhm.
as well. But I did see that your credits are as a music department, and in this one
Okay.
is as a composer. So
Yep.
what is the difference between, in this case, that you are composing the whole score for the film of Your Lucky Day, and being part of like the music department? Is there a difference with it?
Yes, yes. So the main difference is, in it's very common in our business, especially when you're first getting started, but even well into your career, to write as part of a team with another composer, because oftentimes, like this movie, we had a luxurious schedule. I mean, it was like a year and a half to write the score, which is crazy. And because normally, it's the other way around. You get the call and it's like, hey, we've got this, can you score this film? We've got 3 weeks and there's 80 minutes of music. And you're like, oh my God. And so it's so much music to get through that you have to have, some help to get it done. Um, and so in both of those cases with Ma and Our Father, it was actually with the same composer in both cases too. The lead composer was named Greg Trippey. And so I wrote what's called additional music. If you look at like IMDb, it'll say music
Mm-hmm.
department, composer, additional music. And so the lead composer in those cases is coming up with the ideas, the concepts, the main themes, and they're very much, saying to me and any other writers that might be working with them, hey, so this is, the direction, this is the vibe, here are the sounds that I'm using. They might even provide me with pre-records of certain instruments that they've done already. And then I go into the movie and I'm scoring the scene, but it's using their ideas, their vision, and so for me, it's actually like kind of another layer of approval. I have
Okay.
the lead composer needs to approve it, and then it needs to be approved from the studios and everybody else, and director and producers. So yeah, that's a great question because that's a common thing. You'll see it a lot where a lot of composers, work with sometimes they have one dedicated composer that they work with for years, and then there's others like me who I've worked with quite a number of other composers over the years. But Your Lucky Day was mine and mine alone, which is really nice because I get to, I get to be the one. Well, it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, I get to be the one calling the creative shots and really have control creatively over how the music is turning out. But on the flip side of that, you're in the hot seat. Like
Mm-hmm.
I if something goes wrong, if the director or the studio doesn't like it, you're the one dealing with the pressure of that more so than the people who might be writing with you. So.
Okay. And Matt, wanted to ask, were there any challenges throughout you composing this soundtrack? Because you had, I imagine, for what we have been talking about, and our conversation, you had a quite a good time to compose it, but I imagine that there were challenges as well.
Yeah, actually, that kind of was the challenge in a way, was because there's something to be said about when you have a condensed amount of time, and so you're focused really on that one project, and your mind is, you write a cue, and it was just a few days ago that you wrote it, even though it was 30 minutes earlier in the film. It's still very fresh in your mind. With Your Lucky Day, we had an extended schedule, and it was just an independent, fairly low budget film, and so I was working on a multitude of projects throughout doing that score. So I think that was the challenge, was like coming back and going, okay, where was I? You know, it's almost like reading a part of a book and then setting it down for a couple months and then like, oh wait, yeah, that's right. Okay, now I remember where I was. So I think that was a bit of a challenge, but honestly, every time I work with Dan, it's so awesome because he's got just this creative mind that's very different from mine, and and when I work with him, I find that he will throw challenges my way, and I'm like, wow, really? Okay, yeah, let's try that. And then it always ends up being something really cool that I probably wouldn't have come up with on my own. And so that's like the true, you know, nature of like a real collaboration, and that's what I feel like with him is it's a very collaborative process. Sometimes his ideas, we end up going, yeah, that didn't work after all. Sometimes they work great, usually they do. And then vice versa. I'll come up with ideas and it's like, that's not quite the right feel, or I don't know, this feels a little too dark or whatever. And so there's back and forth, and so it's definitely, it's always challenging, I think, scoring a film, because it's kind of a daunting task, and you're trying to capture the spirit and emotion that the director had in mind. And I'm not in his head, so it's, you got to kind of have a lot of conversations and usually a lot of back and forth to determine, okay, yeah, here we go, here's the sound. A specific example of that in this film was, I think I mentioned before, the holiday aspect of it. I did not, when we spoke and I was thinking about the movie, the last thing on my mind was it being Christmas Eve, and that we would in any way want to comment on that in the music. But that was something that was really important to Dan, and I initially was like, "Ooh, that's going to be. I wonder how that's going to work, or if it's going to work." And then it ended up being a really fun, cool element to get, or elements to play with throughout the score that brought kind of a new dimension to it that I think I never would have come up with if it weren't for Dad, Dan's mad genius. So.
Were you inspired by like other composers or other type of music to create this score?
Oh wow. Well, it's interesting. I'm inspired by, I think, just a lifetime of listening to music. I love music. I always have. I always wanted to be a musician ever since I was 5 years old, and before that actually. But I was 5 when I got my hands on my first guitar, and I grew up wanting to be in a band. I loved rock music, so I was listening to like classic rock. And then right around the time I was entering into my teens is when the Seattle music scene really exploded in the '90s, and I was super into the grunge music, Nirvana and Soundgarden and Alice in Chains and all those guys. And I wanted to be that, rock star up on stage. And I grew up just a couple hours outside of Seattle. So my beginning was very different from what I'm doing now, but I moved to Seattle, and I started working at a audio post house when I was 19 years old, actually. And so they were doing mixing and audio for like commercials and TV commercials and stuff like that, and trailers and some games. And so I started to see this other aspect of where how music could be written for different media, and and I had always loved film scores. I grew up watching Star Wars and E.T. and all the classic John Williams, and but then as life progressed, I mean, I loved James Horner, I loved Thomas Newman, I loved Bernard Herrmann, going kind of back to like Hitchcock films. So there was a lot of different music that I loved that was swirling in my mind, but it wasn't until my early 20s that the idea of it was my wife actually who kind of suggested it, but have you ever thought about scoring films? And I was like, wow, that's an interesting idea. And I was kind of afraid of it because I didn't, at that time I was like, I don't know how to write for an orchestra. I don't know how to do this. But I studied under a composer up in Seattle, and started just going out there and saying, to the ad agencies that I was doing sound for, and just started saying, "Hey, I'm writing music now too. So if you ever need some music for a commercial, let me know." And that's how I got my start. And so I wrote. I kind of like, it just suddenly really exploded for me, and so I was able to leave my job at the studio and compose full time back in 2007. And I've that was all in Seattle, and then I moved to Los Angeles in 2012. No, I'm sorry, 2011. Actually, October of 2011. So it's been about 12 years now, and that's when I started. I wanted to get into the longer format stuff. I wanted to be doing TV film, more game work, and there was just a lot more opportunity in LA than Seattle for that sort of thing. So I was fortunate enough to meet a lot of people who needed help with their shows, and I started kind of just jumped into the deep end of the pool, writing music for network series and things like that, and scoring occasional short films, and it just grew from there. But I know this is long-winded, but to get back to your question, yeah. So there's just so many composers that have influenced me, and I think by the time I got to Your Lucky Day, you want it to be your own sound, and I think that's what this is. I'm like a filter. It's like I have all this music that I've listened to in my life that's then filtered through my brain and my perception, and so hopefully what comes out, is something that's unique to me, and doesn't sound like anyone else. That would be the goal. But there's certainly a lot of influence there.
That's amazing. I wanted to ask, it was there a scene on the film that you liked the most to compose? Being the fact that
Uh,
the film is like starts very, very soft and then just goes off the ranks from, I think I would say, like 20 minutes in, it goes
yeah,
off the ranks. So do you
yeah.
have a favorite scene that you like to compose?
That's a really great and difficult question. Boy, it's like picking your favorite child, right? I think I loved scoring, and it was the first thing I scored, actually. I didn't score the movie in chronological order all the
Okay.
time. So I actually did start with the winning ticket scene, where the guy's in the everyone's seen it in the trailer by now, I hope so. But that he's got the ticket, and Sterling, played by Angus Cloud, is in the back, and he's like, "Whoa, this guy just won some serious money." And of course, he'd just been robbed, so now he's kind of feeling vulnerable and like he could use some cash. And so that whole scene was super fun to score. And you'll notice, and I had some fun with it. We threw a little bit of the holiday element into that, so you'll hear some of those things happening. I also really enjoyed. There are some scenes later on when I don't want to give any spoilers or anything away on the movie, but there's some kind of more of the action scenes, like when the SWAT team shows up, at the
Yeah.
the convenience store. Those were really fun, and again, we got to infuse a little bit of holiday vibes into like an action and almost horror sequence at times, like very, very, like definitely thriller, very, very suspenseful music. And then I loved the end, the very ending cue. Not the very end, but I guess when it's one of the last cues of the film. Again, I don't want to give anything away, but it was this very kind of like dramatic, cool, epic piece of
Hmm.
music that I got to
Yeah.
write that I really just I always like that kind of stuff. It's very emotional and very fun to do.
I wanted to ask as well, Matt. Did you get to like sit down with the cast members or anything while you were composing? Or did you get the chance to go to the set to see at least a scene being recorded?
Not in this case. This movie, it's unbelievable, but they shot this film in 16 days, if you can believe that,
What?
which is, yeah, incredibly fast. And it all happened before I was even aware that it had been shot. So I didn't get to be on the set. I didn't, it all happened really, really quickly. And I mean, I honestly, I don't understand how Dan made this movie, having only that much or that little time to shoot. Now, granted, we did have a couple of years almost in post, so that helps, and there's a lot of post work that makes the film feel finished and everything. But that's impressive. But I never got a chance to be on set. I did not meet any of the cast members or even the. I met Dan. Obviously, we've known each other forever. Nick Pizzio, the editor, we met about a year ago. So it was after he came to be part of the review process when we
Okay.
finally had the entire score basically written, and then we wanted to see, okay, how is this working as a whole? What do we want to change now? Because there's always, once you sit back and watch it from a more global perspective, usually there's things you're like, okay, yeah, this needs to be different here, or this is feeling a little slow through this section of the movie, or whatever it might be, and you want to address those things. So I'd met Nick, and then that was it until the Fantastic Fest, where we had our world premiere of Your Lucky Day. and that was super fun. It was my first time to Fantastic Fest in Austin, Texas, and I got to meet some of the cast and other crew, and that was super cool. But during the process, of writing, it's a pretty isolated, lonely existence sometimes to be a composer. You're pretty much kind of in your room in front of your computer and instruments and microphones and doing your thing. And that's why I think it's so fun, especially when we're recording like with an orchestra or something. Oftentimes it's like you spent months by yourself in a room and all of a sudden you're like in a big recording stage and there's 50 people there or 80 people or however big it is, and it's like a really really fun way to end a very otherwise kind of isolated process.
So I wanted to ask, now that you mentioned Nick, how is it working with Nick, being the fact that he was the editor of the film?
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I see, and of course, we're kind of in our own vacuum. So, I didn't have any real communication with him in the beginning of the process, but I was getting updated cuts of the film periodically. And, it's amazing. Like, I see the first cut and I'm like, oh, yeah, this is cool. And this is always the case, but it's like, oh, it needs to be tightened up a little bit. Oh, that's kind of weird there. You can see things, and it's no fault of anyone other than just it's almost like a sculpture, I think, and music is the same way. You start off with this idea and then you whittle away at it until it feels right, and you get you get the final result to where it needs to be. And so every time I got a new cut, I was like, man, this movie just keeps getting better and better and better and better, and just the flow and the rhythm and the pacing and everything. So by the time I didn't even see the final edit until Fantastic Fest, because there actually was some very very last minute changes that were just a little bit here and there. It didn't really affect the music. They were just able to slide it around. But so really, when I saw it at the festival, it was the first time I had seen it fully realized. Everything's done, all the color correction, the CG, the music's all in place, the sound design. So that was it's always a thrill and especially with an audience and an enthusiastic audience like there is at that festival in particular. Everyone was super into it. So that was really fun.
So my final question would be for you today, Matt. If you could describe your lucky day with one word, how will you describe it?
Tension.
I completely agree. Yes.
Yeah.
I
It's a
completely
tense
agree.
movie.
It's a
It's a
very
tense
tense
movie,
film.
man.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just the whole time it's just a pressure cooker. The whole movie, and that's it's just brilliant. I think in that way, the pacing of it and how he takes a pretty seemingly simple concept and how it just gets out of control so quickly.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah.
So Matt, I just gotta say thank you very much for giving us the time to talk about your lucky day and how you composed the film and how everything worked out and those key pieces of you as a composer, explaining those technical things as well. Thank you very much for giving us your time to talk about the film.
Oh, thank you so much. It was just great to be here, and happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween as well for you. Thank you.
All
Bye
right.
bye.